So, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Alan and I will be your co-host. The recording for the seminar today will be on our YouTube channel and also on the seminar archive page. I'll put those links in the chat during the talk. Next month's seminar is by Richard Nothenius. Is that correct, Alan?
Yes.
Oh, good. Showing off the solar system to young school groups. Richard had a PPA mini grant a few years back. And also, if I'm correct, I think he uses an A3P. So that'll be a really interesting talk. That'll be on the third week of next month because of Halloween. And then November will be on the third week because of the Thanksgiving weekend. And then the December talk will be on the second week of December because it always gets busy later in the month. We have a sign up. Please put your name and where you're from in the chat. We don't have a set time for an end. If we go past an hour, we'll pause. A lot of time the discussions continue past that. So Dan, our speaker today, and I'm really excited about Dan joining us, is an associate professor of astronomy and science communication at Nottingham Trent University in the UK. He teaches astronomy. He uses a portable planetarium. He runs an on-site observatory, and he does a lot of engagement with the public and science communication. And I will let Dan take it from here. Thank you, Dan.
Hey, thanks for the intro. Quite an unusual maybe research background. Some of you might pick that up when I'm talking about my work here. That isn't your hardcore standard astrophysics material, which I've also have as a background, having my PhD in theoretical stellar astrophysics and modeling stellar evolution. But this is more my research, which harks back to heritage, archaeology, history, and overall things you would associate nowadays with archaeoastronomy. So, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to start my talk now. So, if that's all okay, I'll now share my slides. And overall, I think if you've got any bigger questions, I'm more than happy to deal with them right at the end, sort of smaller clarifications. Um, I think Rosalind will pick them up as we're going and pipe them through so I can address them. But if you'd want to know how you do a 3D landscape that you can walk through in Stellarium, that might take a little bit longer to explain. So bear with me then towards the end with that question. So without much ado, I'll now attempt a sharing. There we are. And theoretically, that should now mean we're ready to go. So at that point, I'm presuming that's now successfully shared.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Good. So I've tried to theme this in a way that makes a bit of sense, but because I'm covering lots, that's just a small taste, ancient place for skyscapes. So in a way, talking a little bit about an immersive an experience with Stellarium, all of that in the kind of backdrop of being able to run this in a small portable planetarium that can therefore go not necessarily onto site, but very close to some of these relevant sites. So in the name, there's already a few things where I might have to hark back to talk and introduce how I use these or what I understand by some of these terms as I'm going through. So there we are. Just wake this up properly. I've structured that a little bit to go through this general introduction, which gets us going not only from the terminology, but also a little bit from my usual methodology. So I've tried to make sure that my work as it's developing actually sticks to a certain sound basis that is informed by research into some of these areas that I'll touch on as well. And then I'll take us to one of the sites which I found was quite useful as a kind of example, as a showcase to show you how the kind of experiential approach actually adds value and can make the engagement with the site far more informative and possibly also more understandable and relatable. I'll then elaborate a little bit more into immersiveness and sort of delve a little bit into some of the tools. So you will have seen that I use Stellarium predominantly with that. So it'll go into getting panoramas, working with 3D landscapes, creating 3D landscapes of some of the sites you're going to, or scanning them as well. And then doing that sort of in the context of two sites. In addition, Arbor Low, which is quite close to where I live as well, and the site that I'm Gardom's Edge before mentioned, and then King Arthur's Hall, which is down in the south of England. And then I'll finish off towards a more creative overview to show you the power of these sites and how they can really give you that extra angle to go into co-creation, go into engagement, and actually make these sites sometimes come alive and have a longer lasting life and a legacy behind them. So as I said, skyscapes is something that might be new to some of you as well. And I've seen it and it's described many different ways. Quite nice overview by Fabio Silva here given last year. I've seen it sort of in a way in which societies in general and people in general engage with the sky. I kept it very broad, sky in general in a wider sense engage. That means throughout their life by actually seeing it, by inspiring stories, myths, legends, and how they work and live with the sky, where the sky can really be anything that is above you. So we can talk about clouds, we can talk about atmospheric phenomena like halos, rainbows. We then can go to stars, planets, Milky Way, the lot. All of that is your sky experience that you're getting there. It's you can try to sort of symbolize it a little bit here. I've tried it by this kind of skies interacting with people, people interacting with land, land sort of interacting with sky. And at that point, when you're engaging with these sites and really experience that for the first time, that interaction backwards, forwards, and that we all are informed by each other, at that point, you're really getting close to experiencing the actual skyscape itself. Archaeoastronomy, that kind of link between history and astronomy, has a rich background in archaeoastronomy as a topic. Um, Also rich background with a lot of controversy and a lot of misunderstandings. A lot of that coming from the name archaeoastronomy, invoking a kind of aspect of astronomy as we see it now, i.e., somebody with a telescope or observing instrument, logging, measuring, and essentially doing analytical science to the sky. That brings a lot of baggage, and you have to work a lot and very hard to remove that in your approach. So at that point, with the work of Fabio Silva and a few others where I was involved as well, there's the shaping of skyscapes overall, which is similar in its meaning, but removed from preloaded words, and it in its method and its approach tries to focus on pulled out three key things. It tries to ensure that with the kind of exploration of skyscapes, you're now looking at a richer, deeper interpretation that tries to tap on many different angles. So not only the archaeology and astronomy, the ethnoastronomy, history behind it, the mythology, everything that is there, the whole picture. It needs to be reflective. It needs to be critical, constantly reviewing, constantly feeding into what has been explored and done. And especially when you're looking at archaeoastronomy, that sometimes is not always there and has led to a lot of controversy and problems in the wider discussion. It also has to as a basis of this definition include many worldviews. That doesn't mean that we understand and live with many people seeing the truth in different ways, but just acknowledging that there is no thing as the truth. There are things, experiences seen by many people, and they might have a different worldview that is shared by many, and there can be many different worldviews. So, in a way, going into the sense of the certain things and phenomena can be explained and understood and approached in many different ways, which have to be equally engaged with and respected as well. From my approach, I usually try to deal with this in a way of a dialectic approach. And you can think here of something that goes close to what's called a dialectic image, where we're looking at the landscape and seeing all components at the same time. An image where many of the actors are all visible at the same time. That allows us, and in my approach, I try to support that, to enable a negotiation of the meaning of what we're seeing. Negotiation means we're not giving a story A, B, C, D, E, but we're presenting all the A, B, C, Ds at the same time, and the people engaging with that can then make their own mind up what story to tell. So some of that I've given here in the reference if you want to see some background in there as well. A lot of that then harks back to aspects of transformative learning. If we're exploring a site and want to bring people into the site and have that experience, it normally breaks down to three stages that we have. And again, if you want to read a little bit more, I put some of the work that we've done there and some of the theoretical background in there as well. It usually harks back to three things: the separation, the removing people from their everyday environment to a specific new site. And that can be using, for example, a planetarium to whisk them away from their everyday life to then take them or prepare them for a new experience. The transitional liminal space might be within the planetarium, might be a site where you then walk after the planetarium experience to, might be another ancient site that you have been talking to and simulating in the planetarium, you now visit afterwards. That's this kind of space that is now liminal. It's sort of neither here nor there. Exploring these sites sometimes at nighttime achieves that. The everyday becomes strange. And at that point, we've now got them in the right situation and frame of mind to now ensure that whatever you are telling, conveying, or informing them reaches really fruitful ground to grow and capture their imagination. Then the latter stage of the reintegration, taking them back again, supporting their understanding, keeping in touch with them, and ensuring that knowledge stays fresh and people can use or reflect upon that throughout. So these are sort of three typical stages, and that kind of wow moment, that kind of moment that I can see something that's now there. I've grasped the key idea is this kind of sublime experience. That exploring that sublime is a key thing in this middle stage, in that liminal space, and especially when you then get them to these sites, and then, for example, allow them to see and explore the Milky Way as it stretches above an ancient stone circle. These are sometimes these striking moments that allow you to see the sublime. In this case, we're talking about, for example, the feeling of you're at an edge of an abyss looking into an incomprehensible mass of stars or distances in the safety where you are, and therefore now have this awe and wonder that you're exploring. So that's the kind of sublime that we're seeing here and tapping into. And our work has shown that using historical sites, sites with a strong background sitting in time and in the past with history attached to it, is immensely important to allow that to happen, to allow emotional connection and all that, exploring the sublime and having these very immensely striking wow moments in time. These are all linked closely to an emotional connection. Now, when we're talking about planetariums, for example, these are sites that if you try to simulate, let's say, one of these remote sites, Gardom's Edge, where I'm going to be talking about, you have to factor in that you're not actually on the site. And if I'm talking about experiential work on sites, you would actually want to take people there onto the site. So you have the problem that you're dealing with a virtual or a real side. So there seems to be a clash of these two sides. But actually, you have to unpick that a little bit more. I've tried to elaborate a little bit more in detail in a past talk that there actually is no such thing as a real site or a purely virtual site. There's always there are extremes on the on this scale. You can imagine that. Well, if I go to a site, surely that's a real site that I'm exploring. But hang on, if you go to the site, you will have probably tried to find it. So you will have used a map. You will have already used a virtual representation of the site to find where you're going. If you wanted to see where the sun is rising or setting, you might have used an app to tell you exactly when or where that would have happened. You're tapping again into virtual resources for that. in return, if you're trying to recreate an utterly virtual site, that still has to live somewhere in an environment, use certain tools, or use a real site to create some of these things. So there's already that dialectic between virtual or real, that kind of site or non-site. And to some extent, that's also been captured by artists really nicely. And that kind of dialectic has been nicely captured by Robert Smithson, who have popped in here as well, who's talked quite strikingly about this, in a way, dialectic. And he thrives on that this dialectic doesn't cause a solution, but is left unresolved. And that's a little bit, in a sense, creating that liminal, that kind of neither here nor there experience and environment, which is really ideal to allow that kind of a wow moment, that kind of transformative moment of insight that you're grasping here. And a fascinating one to look into as well when you're looking at virtual sites or real sites is sometimes even on a real site, there's things that are not actually tangible that come alive in here. And James Turrell is a beautiful example of trying to illustrate that while using light as a material in there. Also thinking about how, therefore, when you're at a site, rather than looking out, things can be brought in through shadows, light, and the kind as well. I'll skip over that a little bit, but just throw these two artists out there as well, just as a little bit of background so you can see where I'm coming from. That lets me now, ideally, start off with giving you an overview of one of the sites that is quite striking to illustrate the kind of power of this immersive experience, and therefore its usefulness to try to capture that and convey it in planetarium experiences. Gardom's Edge. Gardom's Edge is, as you can see here, fairly slap bang in the middle of the UK. And we've got here a sort of kind of side view. You can see the escarpment where there's some dry stone walls. And in here sit now a very old Neolithic boundary in here, different aspects in here as well that are rich in history that I'll talk about in a minute. But it's an overall high escarpment over some of the valleys in the Peak District, which is an area in the UK, which is a smaller national park. Unfortunately, one of the most populated national parks, what makes it also the most accessible area. In that accessible area, that patch is probably the least busiest. You'll find people either lower or higher up doing rock climbing or walking. On the plateau where we're operating, there's maybe a person and their dog. That's the maximum busyness you'll get there. So that's just one approach for those that are ever in that area that wants to visit us. But the stone itself, that is a standing stone that's located on the site, is surrounded by a lot of different kind of ancient monuments. So as we said, there's as I indicated, a big Neolithic enclosure, a boundary going around, big meaning many 100 meters long. Odd because it's not circular, but it encloses part of that ridge, which is quite strange. It also includes a piece of rock art. So at the bottom, you can see the scale is fairly chunky and big. It's actually in that area the only in situ rock art in the entirety of the Peak District. That's all in close vicinity of now this strange standing stone. So these are side views from different directions of the stone. As you can see, it's not your usual upright stone. It's in its shape more or less triangular in its shape, as we can see here. 2 meters tall and surrounded at base by packing stone. So it's already fairly unusual, bearing in mind that it's not a remote area and it's been farmed a lot as well, sheep and things. You can see there's dry stone walls around it, so it's quite rare to actually find standing stone still remaining there. So as a unique singular standing stone, this is one of the very few, if not the only one in the Peak District at the moment. So what we did at this one is, interestingly, while just using this to talk about archaeoastronomy with school groups in the past, so more than 10 years ago, easily, we came across that this stone was seemingly strange. When I was generally talking about how you can manage to look at orientations and survey tools, when we use that as an example, just as a arbitrary side output, we always noticed it always seems to have an alignment. So not that we knew about it, we stumbled across it as we were working with it. So it looks like that the orientation, i.e., where seemingly that triangular stone points to, is 182 degrees, give or take 2, which means it's facing exactly north-south with a bit of error in there. It's also got a very flat side. The side that we're currently, when you were going around, you could see that fairly straight edge. So if you're looking due south, this is currently the north-facing side. That is fairly flat, and apart from some erosion features, you can now start to measure actually that tilt of that slope. And that gradient, actually that tilt, comes out to be something around about close to 60 degrees. Given the error range here, not too bad. That already sparked some interest because that's, for our latitudes, a quite interesting altitude I'll get to. So we followed that up. This is using PhotoFly as one of the 3D survey methods that was still free to use a good 10 years ago. And we modeled and surveyed that in a little bit more depth. Nowadays, we do that a little bit more precise, so we use our handheld 3D scanner, which goes for just under millimeter precision, scanned the stone, recreated a 3D model. Normally in the talks, when people are around, I have the opportunity to hand around my little 15 centimeter replica, my 3D print of that standing stone. And this is Anna, my student from 2 years ago, that helped me create this stone as a print. But that stone we could now interpret. And at that point, I was very much within the kind of astrophysicist becoming an archaeoastronomer in that terminology. So when you're looking at that, you can do the usual thing. That if you're here in the center of your celestial sphere, you can put your horizon on there, north, south, east, west. You can now place in there your celestial equator that goes across here. And in there, you can trace the paths, the apparent paths of the sun throughout the season. So in summer, it will be quite high up. That's the highest at the summer solstice as the sun moves seemingly through the sky. And in winter, it's sort of the lowest as it moves now here through the sky. All that varying from the highest possible degrees, which is 90 minus our latitude, plus a little bit of the obliquity, or minus a little bit of the tilt. At that point, that gives you a highest angle up here of our 90 minus latitude plus that obliquity of around about 60 degrees. And that's the thing that then sparked my interest, that this tilt of the stone matches the highest altitude the sun can achieve during the day at midsummer. If you pull that apart and look at that, that means that actually in the winter half of the year, the summer here, this grey shaded plane, which is oddly tilted, is the tilt of the north-facing side. So if you're anywhere in the winter half of the year, the sun is always below that plane. So there's no sun shining onto there. That side is always in shadow. If we're now moving into the summer period, you'll see if you just a few weeks after the equinox in the summer, the sun will rise or set and be able to shine onto that north-facing side, but then towards the middle of the day, disappear beneath that, and the side is again in shadow. Only one day of the year will the sun be always above. And essentially at midsummer, you will achieve a total illumination of that side. All looks very, very pleasing from a point of view of an astronomer, looking at that, being happy that coordinate systems and celestial spheres all work, and that all makes nice sense in interpreting what was set up. What now becomes, though, interesting, I've not elaborated, is this intentional or not? So if you can just hark back to some of the papers. Yeah, they're packing stones, and all of that justifies that there's an intentional setup of that stone, and it has been sitting there for many thousands of years in alignment with the erosion features we're seeing. But it still doesn't explain why. Is that really true? Is that alignment astronomical or not? Well, initially with all this work, you always have to ask yourself, is this aligned with anything else before claiming there's any link to the sky? If you're looking at the wider area now, I'm using the archaeological survey plan of that area. So there's the ridge again. There's that enclosure, the Neolithic enclosure, which has a few entrances. Then it has the rock art indicated in here. And then there's the standing stone. And if you look at that, you can see, does the standing stone, remember, this is the schematic side view. So actually the north-facing side points due south. So it's looking that way down to the bottom where this arrow is indicating. If you're looking at what's in that direction in the landscape, well, the enclosure itself, well, yeah, it's somewhere, but it's somewhere between looking to the west to somewhere well past the south. So it's a very wide range area. So it's not really looking at any specific things in the enclosure, for example, the center or any openings in there. It's also not looking at the rock art. Unfortunately, when you're looking at that, there's also, not unfortunately, but there's also some interesting different markers. So if you're walking the site, and this is now where it becomes interesting, where we're now slowly but surely engaging with a more holistic approach of this site. If you're walking and looking around, you can see there's other things in there. So if I go to a larger map, you can look over the valley to the other side. There's a big block of a rock that's not shaped or anything by humans. You can see there's a person next to it. This is a natural block in there, which is called eagle stones. There's another set of blocks over here. They're just sitting here on that neighboring ridge, which is called the three ships. Three huge blocks set up there, also not shaped by humans. They're all natural. These are natural monuments in the landscape, but it's also not pointing to any of these. So that very clearly rules out any orientations within the landscape. So we actually can start to be far more convinced that there's a sky link to that. Now, the next bit is, so why is it where it is, maybe, first of all? And again, just looking at the data, that won't tell you anything. Walking the site, being there, which is essentially what we would call landscape phenomenology, helps you to see that a little bit more. I alluded a little bit to these natural monuments. These are usually quite important because they help you to define a landscape. So they sort of give the area, a landscape, a spirit, genii loci, essentially, to what you can associate. Sometimes you can feel that by when you're walking in a town, and you'll be able to have a reference point, like, I don't know, the Eiffel Tower as you're walking around, or we have a certain set of tall ancient trees around our university, and you can always use them as a reference to see where things are. So already intrinsically, you're using them in everyday orientation and experiencing of the site. So if you're taking these natural monuments and now see, are they visible? And where are they visible in the landscape? So I've shaded red areas here that were accessible to us, and we were able to see the three ships. And that's all of this area. This probably as well, we weren't accessing that. We were just looking at the freely accessible area. All of that, apart from when we were going further to the north from here, there was a cut-off area. We couldn't see that. Then, if you're looking at this eaglestone on the other side of the valley, you could see it quite nicely at the ridge when you're overlooking the valley. If you go further back, the ridge is slightly tilted as you move back, and then increases in altitude a little bit. So you'll see it, then it disappears, and then it appears again. So there's actually this narrow corridor where you can see neither of these natural monuments. The star that I've put in here indicates roughly where that standing stone, Gardom's Edge standing stone, sits. And it actually sits clearly when you can't see it because the star is a bit too big, just in the area where you can't see either. Interestingly, not slap bang anywhere in the middle of this area where nothing is visible, but clearly in a patch where there's nothing visible at the edge. So that's interesting. So it's in a place where you're losing the spirit of the landscape to some extent, and you're not completely gone. It's this kind of liminal. It's just the entry towards that area. So that could give you, again, an argument that this is in a kind of liminal space, in a space that's neither here nor there yet. Ideal to now place, as a people, a new monument and give it meaning. So we've got now, from a landscape phenomenology, an interesting point where we've seen that there is scope to place something there intentionally. And now this is the bit where I'm looking at astronomy from a point of view of shadow casting and looking at shadows specifically. So here it's quite interesting to just look at shadows not as a tool to measure altitudes, azimuths, and time in precision, but shadows as a shadow overall, and seeing how that interacts with objects in the landscape and becomes part of you as well. So there's loads of aspects in shadows that are interesting, defining textures. You can see when you're doing a cartoony sketch or something, without a shadow, it becomes unclear where that cartoon figure sits, if it's above the ground, below the ground, where in context with your landscape it sits. So shadows become important there already. When exploring shadows as well, anyway, you'll see they're never sharp and well defined. Natural shadows tend to be always fuzzy. So at that point, you get that umbra penumbra effect, which can result in loads of fascinating effects as well. And shadows overall have a quite deep meaning for us. So they're very much closely attached to soul and our identity and good and bad as well. So just tapping into some of the European myths, usually I ask the audience and they sort of come to me to some extent with, for example, Peter Pan as one story we might be familiar in Western societies about how, the damage it can do when you sell your shadow or lose your shadows. Playing the shadows and seeing how people can or evil creatures can manipulate their shadow to detach from it. You can see, for example, a good picture here, Nosferatu, a brilliant film, and seeing how shadows are used there, all illustrating the deeper meaning of how shadows are seen by us. And that's not just random, yeah, weird ideas, because all you need to do is, I would say, open your eyes and take your time as you see how your shadow behaves. So this is me walking past a lamppost, and the typical thing you might see as you are walking past a lamppost is that your shadow tends to not just overlay the lamppost and move off. If you're really picky and walk past, you'll be able to see that the shadow snaps towards the lamppost shadow and then detaches and sort of sticks to it. You'll also see this is just my hand. The fingers are always in the same position as I move them through. Here, the speckled shadows of some twigs and leaves in the trees. And you'll see my shadow is not just simply moving, it seems to be weaving in between the twigs. So this seems like it's my hand's shadow trying to move the twigs away from each other to find a path. So again, an experiential way of how we see and experience our shadow sort of moving and feeling the presence of other shadows. Not that it's actually a physical thing, but from the experience, it seems to do this. And in this case, experience is what we would then take for granted. All along one story to show how, from an experiential point of view, we can now approach this site yet again. So in this case, I've left up here my usual kind of astrophysics interpretation, but now getting to a point that if we're looking at the shadow, as we know, over the day becomes initially longer, then midday shorter, then longer towards the sunset. So you'll get varying shadow lengths. The shadow will be shortest at midday. Now, if we're going through the seasons, as we're going through the seasons and entering summer, your shadow becomes shorter at midday and shorter even still at midday. So at some point there is a shortest shadow to be achieved. And in this case, if you're looking at that for our stone, given its tilt, what has actually happened, if you note how the sun now at midday casts a shadow, at that time, midday, midsummer, the shadow of the stone is now not visible on the ground anymore. If you're really picky, you would see how the shadow then moves and actually becomes one with the stone. So that means there is no stone and shadow, there's only stone with shadow. So that's a really important thing to realize. At that point, if we recognize that shadows are important, and for example, look for parallels, some shamanistic traditions include the manipulation of shadows as a key kind of uh, um, initiation and rite to show progression and being able to detach or become one with one's shadow. You can see that this act has now turned this stone into something special, has given it additional powers, has turned it into a new genial loci of the site. This now works in exactly the same way from the principles of astronomy and apparent movement of the sun through the sky as before. However, how it's set up, how it's been used, doesn't require a knowledge of the celestial sphere, doesn't require a knowledge of the obliquity. It just requires an engagement with shadows and their behavior and their meaning throughout. So this, for me, shows a really nice way how skyscape archaeology is very much different in sense as archaeoastronomy, and in this case allows that more holistic experience to flow easier and allow you to tell a more meaningful and powerful stories. That's something that we try to embrace in our communication of some of these sites. So some of these sites tend to be remote. Gardom's Edge, not too much, but still, it's not very busy. To try to tell that story is still a challenging thing. Hence, we did these scans to allow us to create, for example, tangible miniature standing stones that we can take into talks to allow people to handle. We created Stellarium landscapes to recreate what it would look like, how the shadows would move throughout time as well. You can also see in this what's been taken into account, that we have to be very careful that actually we did this for 4,000 years ago, 2000 BC, because at that point obliquity has changed marginally, yes, but compared to the apparent size of the sun, substantial. A good diameter of the sun's diameter has it moved that obliquity. So that's been taken into account. Things that can't be done while visiting the site, just as one example. So that's where virtual sites and planetarium environments with Stellarium are powerful to allow you that exploration. We've turned that into an immersive planetarium experience and are offering that also to our schools visiting us as well. We're just in the process of developing that in more detail. On the bottom right, you can see a snapshot of the landscape with the standing stone and real shadows being cast in Stellarium as well. I'll try to move on swiftly because I know time is always not on my side with this. Is now trying to emphasize a little bit more that that kind of immersiveness that we're trying to capture, i.e., that kind of need to remove ourselves from a theoretical kind of green straight line horizon to something that's contextualized with actually being the real horizon of the site or more meaningful. So at that point, that requires us to actually capture a landscape. So going to the landscape and being able to then take photos and go even further. So I'll talk about that towards the end, trying to include personal, meaningful experiences within the landscape. So you're going from just a sketched drawing to something that is actually real, but then in the latter experiences to something that is photorealistic real, to something that is real with and filled and brimming with your own experiences. So at that point, we use Stellarium for that and use Stellarium landscapes in detail. So I know that there might have been some interest to talk a little bit about the tools that I use. So here, to create these landscapes, what I did is I didn't use an app in my phone initially. I normally, to be quite mobile and efficient, I still capture these landscapes usually with my mobile phone. So to do that is really easy, just ensuring to take lots of images. I tend to keep them landscape and move around, ensuring I always have at least 50% overlap. That means I end up with lots of images. The more the better, because the stitching programs will then have no problems to ensure your level horizon. There's no strange distortion. Sometimes that might require to go several times around to get different height layers as you're stitching that together. Some things that are always tricky is when you're in the field taking these images, you tend to be compelled to remain stationary while moving around. That means your mobile phone, i.e. the camera, is moving while you're turning, which is not a good idea. You have to ensure that while you're moving, you're keeping your camera fixed as you're moving around the camera, so the camera stays stationary. Again, with all these things, you can try to give far more precision to that using a tripod, DSLR camera. But to be fair, this works good enough to a certain level to allow you that experience. If you want to do more in-depth analysis, that's a different thing. Also, a challenging thing is usually you would love good weather. Good weather means clear skies, the sun is out, and you have to balance the brightness and contrast. So you have to ensure that your images are always staying at the same brightness. So sometimes maybe struggling with overexposed images towards the sun, underexposed to the other side. So sometimes clouds are better. Too many clouds, not at all, because you have to later on unpick sky as well. So it's always a challenge, and experience brings that little knowledge when there's a good time. But sometimes it's just you're on the site and the weather is good, so you'll have to deal with this situation as it comes along. So now you've got substantial amount of images. You can see on the left hand side how I've taken some images, and you can see how there's substantial overlap from one image to another. I use a panoramic app later on. Auto Stitch works quite well in an older version, gives me enough manipulation to be quick enough, apart from being super full controllable. So there's other ones. I know if some of you have worked on workshops with Georg Zotti, he uses a slightly different auto stitch program, which gives you far more control over the points it uses to match. I use a fairly quick and dirty auto stitch version, which still allows the landscapes to look good enough. A typical thing I'll elaborate a little bit on here. Won't spend too much time. I can mention more about that at the end. Some of that is also in my publication from a few years back in there as well. Is when you're now creating your panorama, in AutoStitch is created automatically in a nice cylindrical projection, which you'll need for Stellarium, is making sure that the width is fixed at, I put it in a multiple of powers of 2. At that point, you'll have to decide if you want to in Stellarium have it as a single image, 2, 3, 4 panels, and each panel needs to be either 1024, 2048, and so on, 2 to the powers dimensions in X. So you have to make sure that that landscape width is at that size. When you've got that, you can then save that and go into your image processing program of choice. For example, GIMP, all free, does it all. And that's a bit where you would then crop and ensure that now your Y direction is now similarly a power of 2. So 1024 to 2048 in dimension. And when you've got that, you can now happily start removing the sky, however you prefer doing that. The magic wand kind of tool, click and select it away, or other kind of methods to remove sky and ensure that that's replaced with a transparent layer. When you've got that, you can save that in appropriate chunks cut as a PNG, and that will then go into a folder, which is going to be your landscape folder for Stellarium. More details are all in my paper, and I can go into that in more depth later. The folder itself will also have an ini file for Stellarium in which you can then define certain things, obviously where the images sit and so, but there's a few control things you need to put in there as well. That band essentially in your sphere, you can imagine, will need to be defined at which height it sits, or which thickness it has, or how far around you have to turn it so your origins match. These are 3 coordinates, and sometimes they're easily defined by distant horizons or comparing your image with from your photos with the images in Stellarium. For example, if there's a building in there with defined windows, you'll be able to compare the width and height of windows in your original image to what is reproduced in Stellarium. So at that point, you can ensure the stretching becomes correct. Again, if you want to do it more precise, you can take practical tools like clinometers or compasses that allow you degree precision to read off heights and then compare that with your images. And at that part, the latter thing is that just remaining that final orientation to make sure that north is really north in your images, which you can do using compasses as well on site, or you can, when you know where you are, use, for example, Google Maps to quickly do that. All of that gives you a good enough version to create something that I've done down here. That is now my Stellarium landscape with the appropriate real landscape in there that you can now work with and operate. So that's good enough. Is it good enough for archaeoastronomical or skyscape analysis? No, you would need to do that with theodolites and the kind, but I don't think that's where we're currently looking at. So you've got your panorama nicely set. But that's only one part. If we want to really achieve a kind of deep engagement in a virtual way, then it's probably trying to achieve this using 3D landscapes. Stellarium is able to do that as well. So in this case here, we've got now Arbor Low as one of the sites, which sits also quite in the centre of England, is sometimes dubbed as the Stonehenge of the North, roughly 80, 90, 100 meters in diameter. You can see the ditch, an embankment with stones in here as well. A slightly better version here as well in the view. So we can create that in Stellarium and import that. That is the final 3D version of that. And you can achieve that without buying any expensive software. You can do that all using free software. There's, at least for the UK, free LiDAR data available. Obviously, if you get privately LiDAR scans, they will always be a better quality. This is usually good enough. You can then get a free software to use the GIS data. For example, I use QGIS. That then allows you to get a LiDAR data set that then becomes an appropriate, sensible kind of a format to work in Blender, and then import that into Stellarium. That then allows you to bring that into Stellarium and actually load it up and walk in Stellarium through the site. I'll probably not do that here. When I'll finish, I'll just finish with a little bit of a view how I walk across this site in Stellarium, just to allow the flow, and you can see how easy that works. Here, QGIS, just a few hints. It's a free software you can download. There's two plugins that's quite useful. So if you upload the view, that's just the color-coded height image of your LiDAR data. And that if you then use the HCMGIS plugin, that allows you just to overlay, for example, more understandable kind of maps here, a Google satellite view of that. And when you then use this 3D viewer, QGIS has a 3D viewer that is okay, but it doesn't have exports that you can then use for other programs easily. So I found it better to use this I have to check actually. I've done two Gs, so that's my bad. It's checking if that's really true. That should be a Q. Should be a Q GIS 3JS, which also makes sense that that's a Q given that the whole program is called QGIS. That plugin allows you as well to view that as a 3D block, but allows you to export it now in an appropriate format that is a GLTF, which is a program, a format that the next program, Blender, then can easily import, and then you can use that to do whatever you want to in your 3D landscape. For example, I then included additional scans of the stones to then export it as an OBJ file that you can then input into your 3D scenery folder for Stellarium. There's again another ini file that you can tweak and adjust, and that allows you now to import it into Stellarium. And well, it appears, it looks 3D. You can walk around in Stellarium and go down in the ditch, go up. From my point of view, I used that with my student Adam to actually create a virtual field trip and virtually walk and experience approaches to some of these sites along paths that aren't accessible or that aren't accessible at 2000 BC for us to explore. If you're on site, 3D scanning is also possible at high resolution. You can buy the quite expensive handheld LiDAR scanner that we use, or you can opt for at least getting an idea roughly how they look like. I wouldn't say that they're very precise. Some of you might see how here at the bottom there's my ranging pole, and if you check on your screen, you can see how wobbly and bendy it is. Yeah, these sort of get the 3D model okay as the gist, but they're not millimeter precise. So this is one app that's called Scaniverse, and that allows you to walk around the sites quite well, and it takes a bit, maybe 2, 3, 4 minutes to scan a stone that's maybe 2 meters by 1 meter. But what you have to probably take into account when doing so, it is immensely power hungry. So if I go back again, you can sort of see the amount of stones around here. I only managed to sort of scan a third of them with my fully charged new mobile phone, and I needed to recharge it afterwards. So next time I go there, I have to take my power bank, my big one, along with me. So just bear that in mind while working with that. And that outputs another beautiful OBJ file you can upload into Blender and do whatever you want to with that. Just a word of warning, you need to have a bit of experience, but nothing you can't get within a day browsing around and checking with Blender to ensure you get the appropriate views and surfaces on there as well to export it appropriately as an OBJ so it appears in Stellarium. All of that then allows you to really create an immersive experience, and how that fully comes together in the last few minutes, I'll just pack together when talking about another site here. This is King Arthur's Hall, which is in Cornwall, so the far southwest of England on Bodmin Moor. There it is, King Arthur's Hall. The name, this area, everything is sort of related to King Arthur and the myth in some way or another. It is a very unique site, quite unique as was when we were exploring it as part of a public communication project to communicate ongoing digs that were taking place there at that moment in time. The usage was unclear why that was made or for what or when it was even made. There was no dating available, possibly medieval. Other theories were taking it to prehistoric. So at that moment, so it's a very interesting site. What since 2022, I would say we can now it's been under investigation, and I think since probably beginning of this year, we can say that this site is now clearly prehistoric in its origin. The dating material extracted shows that quite nicely. So it's definitely a site that has captured a lot of awe and wonder and curiosity by the local public as well. And it's also slap bang in a designated dark sky site. So really a unique site to fully start to explore some of these things. And here are some of the views that we've created here. This is a cross section through two sides of our planetarium tour that we show that we developed, running it in our digital planetarium here, an Emerald digital planetarium, and all of this was run using Stellarium. So we created a realistic 3D landscape. The stones were still in an early production phase, so they're not high resolution. They're just indicative blocks, more or less. But the landscape is the LiDAR scanned in there, has a realistic light pollution in there as well. And we created a immersive walk. So we took the visitors from a few hundred meters outside the site into the site. We also created arc-minute precise horizon and landscape that is fully calibrated to explore any additional features that might have been seen on the site as well. So to do that, we ensured that our team was fully trained for that, but also trained in a sense that they knew what they were doing. They knew more about the landscape. They engaged with the landscape. So everyone working on the material had been there before as well, ensuring again there's that close connection. The show as well contained co-creative material. So when we showed constellation, we also showed some meaningful constellations for the people. We asked them to create the people living in that area their own land, their own constellations that we then use for our later shows. So much so that here you can see there's a kangaroo. As some of you might remember, kangaroos are not native species for the UK at all. Interestingly, for this area, they have become apparent in some areas as a farm has reared them and they escaped. So in the news, the year before we visited, there were some escaped kangaroos roaming around the moors there, and that reflects that quite nicely. So suddenly you can see when you're talking about that, you're now tapping into existing memory of the relevant cultural groups and communities in that area as well. So what we did is, yeah, we showed this to a larger audience as well, then having co-created that and shaped our work with that as well. But as I said, it's always only part of it. So we had them in the planetarium show, and afterwards they went for guided landscape walks. They went into the field. They saw this site. They then also explored it in some cases with photographic workshops as well, and followed that up also with stargazing. So having set them, for example, up into this liminal space, having taken them away into the planetarium, shown them what is there in this strange way, as planetarium allow you to take you on a travel through time to this place where there's no light pollution, what is going on there, then into the landscape, so they can now look at the site with slightly changed views. And this is a little bit of impact capturing, where in a few words we've managed to actually do change them from initially having quite a lot of views on these on these sites, very much focused on the what's on the ground, opening them up to then see afterwards a lot on their experience, to then see what's in the sky, being able to successfully link them to stars, linking them to the sun, linking them to observing what is happening in the skies and watching the processes as well. So I'll skip over that to maybe get to the last part where I'm starting to wrap up, is then my ideas of trying to now push this. You remember when I was saying at the beginning with you can try to make these sketched landscapes realistic, photorealistic, so they are meaningful, but now actually they're only showing the real photographic landscape, but what does it mean to you? At that point, that's one part that we've started to explore when we were dealing with one of the historic sites called Creswell Crags Caves, actually close by to us in Nottingham. And we explored these caves, created planetarium sessions within the caves, but also scanned the caves and recreated in our planetarium. Here you can see these are, the background is the real cave. On there, superimposed are images from some of the members of the public that joined in in our exhibition. This is Writing Skyscapes. There's a QR code if you want to visit our virtual exhibition. So they created art outputs. They were included in there. All of that put together and created a 20 minutes immersive experience in the Planetarium show, where people could come in there, hear some of the poetry that was created, see some of the imageries, and be taken into this tranquil environment to then reflect on what sky means for them as well. So at that point, we've really taken these landscapes and now added artistic, creative ways, and that's really easy to use. If you've seen what the basic backbones of the landscapes are, they're just PNG files. So if you've got everything set up and they work and they look good, you can just draw and graffiti or collage what you want into these JPEGs, if you into these PNGs. If you then copy paste that across and load it again into Stellarium, it will do the same thing, but this time your landscape will be enriched by these additional collages. And just another example, I did this with a local school, and we explored the origins of different elements and materials that they've seen. They then explored where they're coming from in stars and galaxies and planetary nebulas and supernova. They superimposed some of that over key areas in the landscape and then created that kind of beautiful collage of their landscape. So in that planetarium show that we then used for their show, they had co-created their own meaningful landscape that was contextualized with this rich understanding of, oh, you've got your school landscape, but you can see there's mostly rock, then there's more biological material, and overlaid were certain supernova explosions like the Crab Nebula, or there were other astronomical objects superimposed and artwork put in there as well. So overall, wrapping up, I've hoped I've shown sort of a hodgepodge of different things that were sort of angled around my kind of approach to creating an immersive environment within the planetarium using shadows and interpreting with them ancient sites. Here, for example, Gardom's Edge. And a quite nice one, Gardom's Edge, because it gives us that opportunity to see how an immersive engagement with the landscape is actually really key to convey a meaningful, striking experience. So here, Gardam's Edge, that standing stone, I've hopefully showed that standing stone has a meaningful alignment, and shown you the two sides of the north-facing side is tilted to a maximum altitude of the sun, which is your astrophysics approach. Two, stone and shadow become one, which is in essence the same thing, but just approached differently. But if you're now looking at the meaningful impact, the latter, stone and shadow become one, seem far more strikingly understandable for people 4,000 years ago, and also carries a far more striking meaning and message for this site. And that's all nicely captured through some of these opportunities that Stellarium offers that you can then use in your planetarium to create these virtual sites. Bearing in mind that some of these sites I was talking to are actually not just around your corner in your back garden, but you have to travel an hour or two or over rough terrain, or for others, it might just not be accessible at all, given that you need to walk to these sites. So overall, maybe try to explore sites yourself, use shadows, explore them. And I can talk for length about all the weird and wonderful things you can explore with shadows, but try to see some of the aspects that that Stellarium offers you to explore 3D structures and sites as well. Thanks a lot, everyone. Just before I end, I'll probably just switch over to my Stellarium and just showcase two or three things that I was showing, and then I'll be quiet and see if there's any questions, which means I'll need to, there we are, stop sharing here, then share again, and bring up this one now. So there we are. And at that point, hopefully, there we are. That should now nicely show Stellarium, hopefully. That's now visible, I'm guessing, Stellarium, yeah? Yeah, good, brilliant. So at that point, unfortunately, it's now turned dark here, my area. So I'll just rewind a little bit, and you can see there's a Stellarium landscape I was talking about beforehand with the images I put together as well. What I'm now doing is I'm switching away from that 2D boring landscape to something that's more exciting, and switch on now. There we are. I'll just use a slightly different landscape. My zero horizon, there we are. And we're now standing in my 3D Stellarium landscape of the site I talked about beforehand. And this is, we can see now, arbor low. So if I now start to move around, okay, I can see these are sort of just about, you can recognize some of the lumps and bumps I showed you before of the landscape. But actually the power of this is that within Stellarium I can move around, which you can do by pressing shift and then the arrow buttons. You can start moving, or shift control arrow buttons, or shift control, you move a little bit quicker. So I'll now move into the ditch. Down we go. I picked exactly the one which is the path. There we are. So as I'm going down into the ditch, you can see how the horizon changes. And as I now make my way up the ditch towards the mound, you can see now how my views open up. If I now slightly swifter move around to head onto the larger mound. There we are. As I'm heading up to that mound, I'm now able to look into the monument, spin around. I'll be able to see other aspects of the landscape that we were exploring as well. I'll just take the time a little bit back so you can see. There we are. There's a landscape. And you can see there's another monument associated to that. As well, what you can do is then, if I just view down and take you up, we'll be able to, there we are, now fly above the site. And at that point, you'll now see how I'm now hanging at 61 meters above the site, and you'll be able to see there's a stone circle, the ditch is the embankments. But rather than it being a stagnant 3D environment, you can actually move and walk around in it. That's all I wanted to do with this part. Happy to take any further questions and elaborate into things that are a bit more technical if you want to now. Thanks a lot.
Let's unmute if you'd like to and give Dan a round of applause.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is very good. I'm sure we have lots of questions. We have a few already in the chat. For anybody who needs to leave now, you're welcome to do so. I think many of us will be hanging around for questions. We have a few already in the chat, so let's start with them. Jeff and then Sarah.
Yeah, hi, great talk. And I was just wondering, you stitch your own panoramas. Does that
Yeah.
mean that the native panorama mode in your smartphone camera isn't good enough for this kind of work?
The problem is I've never had time yet to study how well that works. I just have the feeling if you do that, if I'm not mistaken, it does everything for you, which is the danger. It removes everything. It then just gives you the final panorama, and you're left with it, take it or leave it. If it's not good enough, you have to do it again. So if you capture your images yourself, you can then create your panorama and then see how good it is. Leave it, yes, or lose it. Yeah, delete and redo it again at your PC. If you then find out that it's not good enough at home, you can't then just quickly nip back into the field. That's the challenge. So I always prefer doing it that way because there's so much things that can go wrong with these apps. That's just one thing that I'm not sure. I have to confess, given that these things improve that quickly, I'm not sure how good they are and which ones you would use. But the problem is then you would have to say you would need to use exactly this one or exactly that one. And as I tried to illustrate, I used a good 10 years ago PhotoFly when it was still freely available. And then you did all your work, and then a few years, 2 years later, it was all pulled, and you couldn't do anything with that. And then I had to wait ages before we got to the point where some things like Scaniverse are optional again and available as well. So, yeah, I personally would just feel I'm safer with having the actual data in front of me to a point that you can use more sophisticated software. Beats me, I have it in my notes somewhere, the kind of stitching software that Georg Zotti uses, where you have then full control. You can go into seeing when the initial software runs, which 10 reference points it uses to stitch things together. One thing that I want to say here, it's all nice. If you note with the landscapes for Stellarium, there is an additional option to input in there a light pollution night layer, so that when the sun sets, it fades from the usual landscape into that night landscape. You can add that in there as well. You need to capture that. For King Arthur's Hall, we captured that as well. Uh, but you can see the challenges there. If you're in the middle of the night capturing the light pollution features and you're then using your panoramic app, that won't work. It's not designed for these low light levels. So you'll need to mess around with whatever setup you're using. If you're using long exposed DSLR, or as I did, slightly dodgy diagonal fish eyes that sort of work-ish. So you have to stitch and work with that. So it's always better to have the raw data with you and work with it. As an astronomer would know, if you go and observe, you would not want to come back with a light curve that has been determined. You want to come back with your raw data so you can fix and match and do with what you've got and fix things that come out of that.
Great, thank you.
I think I'd also like to just jump in and say that the Stellarium manual has a chapter on 3D landscapes, and also there are a couple of 3D landscapes that contributors have given on
Yes.
the
Yeah.
Stellarium website if people want to play
What?
around with that.
Yeah, I think really, if you want to get started on that, play around with Google SketchUp. That's probably the easiest and best way to go about it. Google SketchUp, export as OBJ, and off you go. And Bob's your uncle with that one. It works a treat, and you can play around and explore that. And many things, if you can see that, I think the Sterngarten in Vienna, I think was probably created by Georg in there as well, which comes with that automatically. That's, I think, using things like Google SketchUp as well. However, if you want to get more realistic views, Google SketchUp can, to some extent, take sort of LiDAR data from Google Earth, but it's really not that good, and it's quite problematic to get that in and can turn it into something quite nasty and computationally heavy. So taking LiDAR data and working with QGIS is, from my experience, works far, far better as well. And then later on, trying to overlay things with Blender and putting them in there makes life so much easy.
I guess I just want to follow up with a couple of short questions. One was in the
Hmm.
chat and one's my own. Um, Towards the end, before you put in the full 3D model, you had like a 2D landscape with
Yeah.
had a stone in it and a shadow. So is there anything in between that you can do between the full 3D and a 2D landscape that have like one 3D object in there and get shadows from, or is that
No, not really. I would say the in-between thing is what to some extent was in there as well, was essentially let's imagine you've got a Scannerverse, a very quick OBJ model you've done while walking around the stone with your mobile phone. That outputs easily as an OBJ file, and you can just whack that into, for example, Google SketchUp to give it a plane and a reference so it can cast shadows and things, and then have that as an OBJ. That's probably the easiest. It will still
okay?
mean you'll have to go down the route of working with the 3D scenery, i.e. a 3D landscape, but not with the full LiDAR and things like that. In many cases, you might not need that at all. If you really want to go berserk, you can follow some of the ways that Georg Zotti has used, where he uses that in conjunction with Unity as well. So at that point, he creates really amazing, intricate tools where you can actually see an ancient shadow casting dial that you can read off alignments and things, where you can move it in the setup, and it will then cast a correct shadow. You can read things off, where you can engage with things. I've never done that because it goes far beyond what I want to achieve or want to do with that part. But that's then where it goes even further. But between a 2D landscape and something that's 3D to cast shadows, I think there's no subtle in between thing. You could envisage it might be something where it's a 3D landscape where you can't move around, but I think at that point, having a 3D landscape and then moving is just at the tip of the fingers. That's why there's no in-between point. It is slightly different in how to cope with it. does mean now throwing in everything that the OBJ outputs and working with that slightly different file with all of these things, even with the landscape ones, when you start working with them, the easiest is take a landscape that works and cannibalize it, sort of just rip it apart, put in your images, see what happens, and work from there. The same thing I would do with a landscape in 3D, a 3D scenery as well. Do the same thing and see how that comes together to get a feel for what some of these parameters mean. To be fair, at this moment in time, there's still some things, even 10 years after working with the 2D panoramas, which I just tear my hairs out because I just don't know what it's doing there. And that will probably always be the case where sometimes it just doesn't work and I have no idea, and you just have to go back to square one. Um, it works. It's not something that is so alchemistic you need a PhD to solve it. For example, I did a summer school with 15 to 17-year-olds a few weeks in the past, and we did that over a few days. And having done their own data within a day, they were able to stitch it together, put it into Stellarium, and get it to work. And pop in their random pictures and things they've put in there and found funny that were meaningful while visiting the site and as well. So it works. It is a sometimes a painful tour, but sometimes it has lots of things you have to learn about your PC more than actually with the Stellarium work itself. But it's not too difficult in that, in a sense, it's literally just creating four PNG files and then coming out. What's probably the trickier thing is making sure that they meaningful are correct for your area. So you can easily just create four PNGs, put them in there, and you've got some fun backgrounds. But that they actually match together, that they actually show your site, that's a bit more work, and that they're probably aligned and things, that's your next level. But you can see if you want to go even further than that, you would take a mobile phone, you would use a theodolite, you would to survey the site, you would use a tripod to take the imagery and so on. You would really push that further. The last one that I showed in King Arthur's Hall, that was one where we had arc-minute precise theodolite measurements and ensured that our imagery, the photographic imagery from that site is perfect to that level as well.
So just a quick statement, I think, is more than a question. A lot of us use a 3D camera to take an image and erase the sky and get landscapes that way. And it seemed, just a quick question, it just seems from what you do that that's probably too simple in order to start
It depends what you want to achieve. That's the thing. Like you could argue that the Scaniverse version of My Standing Stone at Gardom's Edge would have been too rudimentary, because it wouldn't be capturing all the runnels and nooks and funnels and everything to get to a good enough understanding how the shadows would have looked like. But for, let's say, Arbor Low, where I just wanted people to see that they are stones and how they're lying, even to the point that out of fun, you could roughly crop and rotate them to simulate how they would be looking if they were standing up, if you knew how high they would have been. These things you can do, but you have to always understand what level you want to show. Do you want to just show them roughly what's there? Do you want to give them a gist what's there? Or do you want to use it to now survey orientations and alignments and things like that? That's where you have to sit. With Scaniverse, I know this is sort of medium size. It gives you the option to scan larger blocks, like buildings and things. I've not started exploring that, how good that is. I've also not whacked it onto a drone to start to take larger field views. What I would do is I would see that if you go so large, and I would use LiDAR, and then smaller scales, I would then go for more handheld scans overall and explore that. So that's probably more of the story is look at what you want to do with that and where you want to sit. That's where you would then choose the appropriate approach.
Sarah, did you want to ask this question? If not, I'll read it. So she wonders what kind of guidelines or write-up you might have for the summer school you did. That might be fun for other people to try to implement.
Okay, there's a few. So with this one, I don't have any specific guidelines or anything that I do. What I can do is try to give you a bit of an overview what we covered in that one as a 1 minute whistle stop tour through this. Maybe if that's helpful. I don't know. Would that be something that could help to illustrate what that might be? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So um, it was essentially an attempt to introduce 15 to 17-year-olds into archaeoastronomy, essentially archaeology, astronomy, and the sky, and how stellarium is used. So what we did is over 5 days explored this, and usually these sessions were a morning more theoretical, workshopy, and an afternoon which was more IT-based hands-on lab. The Monday, the first day, was essentially giving an overview of the key concepts of astronomy. So lots of these things, you still need to understand coordinate systems. You still need to understand the basics of how the stars seemingly move through the sky, through the Earth's rotation, but also understand aspects like obliquity, the properties of Earth's orbit, the properties of the lunar orbit as well, to understand why, for example, Skyscapes is so powerful to tell stories, because you can have these objects acting in very strange and distinct ways. So, for example, the moon is a beautiful example that seemingly goes backwards through the stars, shows varying shapes in its appearance through phases. Stars do that as well. Either they rise, they set, they're permanently visible or not visible. That's a boring side. That's a standard one. You also get stars that you wouldn't describe as, in their experience, circumpolar. Because when you're seeing them, they're above the horizon. When you stop seeing them at the night, they haven't yet set. The astrophysicists would sit back and say, well, the arc goes below the horizon, so they're not circumpolar. But that might be, at that current time in season, something where you wouldn't see that. From the experiential side, they have turned into circumpolar stars. So suddenly that changes over season. So you suddenly have stars, certain stars that can act as circumpolar, not circumpolar, disappear. So that's the idea that we bring in, that understanding the kind of celestial mechanics slowly but surely, you get an idea of how these actors in the sky can vary in their appearance. And to explore that, obviously, we need Stellarium. That's where the beginnings are set, but then the afternoon is a whole introduction of what's Stellarium, how to use it, key aspects of how to maneuver around and explore things, rising and setting of the sun on the horizon, measuring the azimuth. The second day then takes them into understanding aspects of archaeoastronomy. The first one was more astronomy, setting all the astronomy sides of archaeoastronomy. The second one then gets them understanding ancient sites, the archaeology side. So understanding a little bit about the timeline, about Bronze Age, Iron Age, understanding a little bit about how people moved around in our area in Europe, about Ice Age, England being detached or attached to the mainland, introducing these aspects, and then being able to, now I have to make sure I don't get that. Yeah, so at that point, then understanding aspects of archaeoastronomy, alignments, then seeing, discussing examples like Stonehenge, and then seeing how landscape and monuments and sky link together, using Stonehenge as an example. And then the afternoon, we used Stellarium and its archaeoastronomy links in there to introduce people why it's now important to put in their realistic horizon profile to see where the sun rises or sets, or why the atmosphere is important, or why we have to include the right date as well. So we can't just do the simulation calculations for current age, but to the right time that we're setting that. The Wednesday then allowed them to explore more the observational tools, so shadow casting, sundials, understanding that a little bit more, talking about some of these Gardom's edge standing stones in more depth, then taking them into how do I capture a panorama. We talked about some of these things, taking them to a site on our university to capture for themselves panoramic images, and then the afternoon was spent coming back, importing them. Surprisingly, importing images on university PCs with students' mobile phones is the biggest challenge of everything. Having done that, they then learn how to stitch them together and make them work to then import them into Stellarium. So they've essentially had a landscape that sort of works. The Thursday is then where we take them entirely away from, I forgot the Tuesday evening, we then take them to our NTU observatory. So they are working on site in the city. We take them to our observatory in the evening to showcase how our observatory observes, how we use our spectrograph and things, so exposing them to modern aspects of observing and astronomy. The Thursday is the key important one where we take them out into the field. So they're actually with us doing a field trip, exploring and walking through the historic site, and they go on this experiential walk. They see and hear the different layers of history in that site as well with us. Then get to the site, then have little tasks to, for example, use compass clinometers to measure things, and then we let them loose in the landscape and tell them to sort of capture or find relevant things and take pictures of things that might incorporate and include some of the experiences they've had on site, and then find a place where they can take a panorama that means something to them. Now they've got all the tools to do that. And on the Friday when they come back, we then support them putting that all together and creating a landscape of that historic site, but including some of them included their mates trudging through the woods or something like that, or I don't know why dinosaurs. They included dinosaurs in there, and they just went arty and mental by putting things together in there that meant something for them. But it showed there that they had that deeper knowledge. Then, interestingly, I finished with a sort of 2 hour kind of role play that we then did, where I illustrated the kind of challenges and understanding of heritage in astronomy by throwing them into the deep end to explore a theoretical scenario where they were representing different members of the public, discussing the planning for a new radio telescope that will be huge and allowed to explore the wonders of the universe. I don't know, the origins of dark matter or something that I was throwing in there. By building that, you would have to just bulldoze a half of Stonehenge, which would be perfectly fine because it would be for the greater good. And then I would have certain actors, they would have little sheets, what they would represent, and they would all start discussing. It's all nice until you then, as activities, I had 3 or 4 little cards where I just pull someone out and just say, well, you are an English heritage, you're working there, so you're supporting the all the preservation of the monument. However, English heritage is supported by the UK government. Here is the guidance. You have to pull the line. You have to support this project because the government sees that as something providing jobs. In they get sent again, sort of to just stir it up. And that just created a wonderful discussion and brought together all their deeper views of values in and heritage of sites in the context of modern day astronomy. And it's so relevant if you look at these sites nowadays. 30-meter telescope in Hawaii, the discussions raging around that, the SKA project as well, and their immersiveness of then tapping into the heritage and indigenous people in the area in both Australia and South Africa as well. It's just key to our understanding how this impacts many what we're doing. I think
So,
that's a whistle-stop tour of these 5 days, roughly to give you an outline. But it's always a nice match between sort of theoretical workshops that feature astronomy, arcastronomy, observing tools and shadows with Stellarium virtually through every day.
people should just raise their hand or ask a question. We went through most of the chat. I might have missed one, but you can
Well, I
speak
wanted
up.
to ask Sarah's question about 360 panoramas are totally okay in Stellarium. If someone has a 360
Oh,
camera.
okay. Good point. I never use them a lot, to be fair. Um, in the panorama setup of Stellarium, it's a different mode that I sometimes struggle with to fully manipulate and operate with. So I just struggle a little bit with that. In some cases, they're okay, but I just felt that I personally didn't have the ability to control too much with them. And at that point, if there was something again not properly set up or worked at, then I couldn't manage that appropriately. So there were some instances where I worked with them. I have to think. I had the feeling that the one with the caves in one version was as well a 360. So I'm not the biggest fan of them. I prefer to have full control and work with them and stitch them. It has all the pros and cons. To be fair, if you really want to get a good landscape in Stellarium, you're doing that because you want to see the sky. At that point, you probably want to have at least the landscape cutting off at 30, 40 degrees altitude. And at that point, having a 360 doesn't really help.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I just wanted to wonder how much was your LiDAR equipment? You mentioned it was a little expensive. Do you remember about how much it was?
Yes. Um, we pushing that. Well, we have to be careful. I don't have LiDAR equipment. That's a complete different thing. So no, this is all freely available LiDAR data. The scanning that we had is it's a handheld 3D scanner, which is I wouldn't describe it as LiDAR fully, but it's getting close to it. But that is a portable field unit that you can take out, works with batteries, and is fairly robust. That, though, pushes it towards the 15K at that time when we bought that to control and work with it. That meant for our budget, that was nearly swallowing three-quarters of the entire budget to do that. So that's a challenging thing. However, if you look nowadays, this is always what makes my eyes water. When you look at some of the equipment you can purchase, you can do that at a tenth of that nowadays. However, what you're not getting is the precision. Uh, Anyone can correct me, but I always have the feeling if that kit can do this, but not at that precision. So ours was ensuring the photographic precision, the colors were precise enough reproduced, and also we were sticking with sub-millimeter precision in here. So I can't show it in here, but on my stand when you're in the on the site, there's a pattern of nooks and crannies that look like as if they were a human. That tempts people to interpret this as being a carving of a human on that stone. Yeah, fat chance that would have survived 4,000 years of rain, so it would have washed away utterly. However, that's what it looks like. Interestingly, our 3D scanner manages to capture that, and our 3D print has that in there as well. So when I hand it around, people can still see that. In Stellarium, you can still see that kind of feature appearing as well. Um, how precise is it as well? I recall, I don't have it with me. When we tested and did that, we scanned one of the concrete barriers in our university, like a boring cylindrical kind of half a meter tall block thing. And they were scanned and everything. And when they were reproduced, my students said, "Oh, look, on the 3D print, you can actually see the ladybirds." And then we went back and you could actually see there were ladybirds captured and the 3D print, i.e. the model was good enough to see the ladybirds sitting on there. So that's what you get with that precision. To be fair, probably nowadays you'll operate at something that's a little bit above 10K. But looking at what they've got now, I think the unit that's equivalent to that now is one that we needed still a laptop to plug into the unit. I think you could see it with my students that were with laptops holding it. That's a bit of an art to do that. It works, but these units, the LiDAR now is the handheld 3D scanner has that now inbuilt as well, so it becomes more usable in the field. So you're back again to probably 15K or something like that from that provider. So more or less in that area. It is cutting edge kit. So if some of you have seen some other documentaries where people scan sites as well, so you'll see these kind of scanners popping up here or there as well. So they are not cheap, but not outlandish in price. However, it's again, what do you want to achieve? If you want to achieve just a landscape in which you can show, look, there's a standing stone, this is how it looks like, then using your mobile phone and Scaniverse walking around there and putting that in there works perfectly fine. As soon as you put a ranging pole in there to see how well it's worked and to align it and things, you'll see how wibbly wobbly that really is. But it's good enough to showcase what's there.
And I'm assuming it's an investment. It's like you get to keep this and you get to use it forever and ever for other
Yes,
projects, right?
indeed. So that's one thing. So the background was that we got that as a knowledge exchange program. So we had that to support a network, to build up a network of academics in our university, including the logistics of both purchasing the equipment, setting up a pipeline, but also the supporting logistics in and around that. I don't think, yeah, that also included creating a portable mini dark room that we could take out anywhere. So we could rock up, have a standing stone, put up a big parasol, and over goes the curtains. And in the middle of nowhere, you suddenly have created a virtually blackout area in which you can have controlled lightings as well. All of that with which PCs will we need, how will we need to work with no power on site, and what would happen if it now chucks it down with rain. All of that was set up and created. So that's why, for example, the output of the King Arthur's Hall landscape still has the fairly blocky rectangles of the standing stones in there, because we hadn't yet completed the final stages of this scanning and analysis, because we were still working on that. But yes, we kept hold of that equipment, and it's become part of projects we can offer for our master students. We've used it in different other ways as well. Last thing we used it for before that was probably scanning a historic library and its Meridian Sundial that was in there. So we can recreate it in Stellarium again and visualize how the sundial works to the visitors of that library, so they can see how that sunspot moves on the ground, for example, around.
So it sounds like a great return on investment for anyone who wants to, put in for one of these.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Definitely, from my point of view, it's a cool piece of equipment, but it requires work to sort of establish not only buying it, but having a good enough understanding of that and its intricate twerks and strangeness as it behaves as well.
And then my
So,
last question would just be that you put all this stuff in Stellarium. Have you tried it in a commercial planetarium software to see how it differs, how it looks different? No?
No, so this is the interesting part. So I'm very much somebody who's come from using Stellarium for this, and only in the last few years have now taken it into a planetarium, in this case, into a portable planetarium. So I've not worked with um, fixed dome planetariums and therefore more advanced planetarium software overall. So I haven't used that at all. What I have used for these shows is essentially a not ideal workaround to capture an appropriate 180 view of the dome and from Stellarium, and then using that as a movie, or as we're soon going to be doing, using these Stellarium models and 3D landscapes to then our viewer in the Emerald Planetarium allows us to use Stellarium, and that one allows us then to use the 3D plugin in Stellarium as well, so we can then walk around in there as well. Again, what I haven't done here is recorded that. And I think, Rosemary, you had a question about that when we chatted as well. I had a bit of look. Yeah, you can capture imagery from Stellarium within Stellarium, but there's no way in which you can start, let's say, a movie recording in Stellarium. So that's not possible. You have to use, in my case, I use, for example, OBS to capture what was coming in. That always caused for me a massive reduction in resolution. So even though my small planetarium wasn't brilliant with the resolution, it still was noticeable worse than what Stellarium could as itself offer. So now I'm probably going to opt to see that I get a working script to run and take me through, or I just do that as I tend to do then, have that all operated by the demonstrator inside the dome.
Yeah. Well, then I'll just do a quick plug. So I'm from Skyscan, and we can do all this stuff, no problem. And so if you're interested, I'll just pop my email in the chat for you.
Cool. That would be really good to just see what we could do and see how we can take that to the next level. Brilliant. Thank you.
so we're coming up on half an hour of discussion. If Dan's willing to stick around a few minutes, if you haven't got your question in, maybe he can give a quick answer. And I'd also say that we will be putting this in the usual places. And Dan, I hope we can share your slides. There's a lot of good resources on there. So you can just email them to me or send me the link or put it here, and we'll put that with the recordings. So
Yeah.
I'll
No
turn this
problem. If there's
over.
anything coming up as well, if anyone might be interested in some of the landscapes and seeing how the backbones work of that, more than happy to provide you with some more files on that or downloadable resources as well. Probably some of the links in there help you quite nicely to give a bit more of background as well on the theory, on some of the other literature around there as well. That's probably quite good. I think what's also quite good is to sort of stress the methodological background on the experiential approach. I think is quite key to realize, and that's very strong to make something that I think is quite close to your heart, Rosemary, the kind of place-based, the
Yeah.
making it relevant for where you're delivering this. And co-creation is a big underlying thing, but co-creation is one part that helps you to have input from the audience, but it goes further than that. It's actually seeing what's there. Um, I can just a small anecdote, if I may, at that point is when I was capturing the night sky panorama to capture that light pollution layer. I had to obviously go onto site. My students were all too tired; they didn't want to join me. They always tried to say that wasn't the case, but that was what happened. So I was there on my own. To actually do this properly, it wasn't too bad. You could park on a bumpy, lumpy field track 400, 500 meters away and then make your way onto site. So doing that and having done that many times, you don't take your horribly big torch with you, not at all. You get out, wait a few minutes and take your miniature LED flashlight, dim it down with your thumb to virtually nothingness so you can at least see what's just in front of your toes. That's about it. And then off you go taking bearings from the start so you know where you head back and to from. That's all fine. Off you go. So I started setting up things on one of the ridges of King Arthur's Hall. Set up my cameras starting to work, but doing so you'll have to set up screws and things. So you, even with your low light level torch, you have to cause a little bit of light pollution, start flashing the light around. And as soon as I was doing that, I must have disturbed some of the roaming herds of horses that are around there. Not that you could see them anywhere, no sign of any horses. So you are imagining now you're in the middle of virtually nowhere, alone. It's a beautiful night, just a few wispy clouds there, utterly darkness. And in the middle of nowhere, you can hear the neighing of horses and the ongoing stampede that's coming from the right, going past you, just audio, no sense of anything being there, fading away to the left. So that's also quite striking. That changes that experience of that landscape immensely.
Yeah.
And that's something that, hadn't we have captured it in this way, I would have never put exactly that kind of audio that I sort of afterwards managed to recreate into that experience so that people could actually hear that happening. And if you're thinking about myths, so you've got the Great Hunt as something as well, where people see the gods hunting and ranging in the skies. And if you experience the Great Hunt, you're normally doomed because your soul has been hunted down and torn away from you, and you're forever soulless. So one of these things is it's always quite nice to have these odd experiences in the site while visiting and exploring sites, and that usually never happens when you visit them virtually or just rock up there, take your data, disappear as quick as possible. So you have to take your time. I've tried to indicate that a little bit in my writing by mentioning that these are usually instances where you don't observe. Observing always looks like you take your a clipboard out, peer through your eyepiece, note, and disappear. Watching is what it's actually about, going there and taking your time to see what you want to see. In some cases, you need to let time pass. So essentially, the flow of time becomes experience in a different way. Where observing takes it as an instance, you need the flow of time to develop and pass so you can see the rhythms of the night unfolding in this case and explore things that you wouldn't have expected. That's what sort of enriches a site, makes these experiences place-based before you then even start with the co-creation. And the co-creation will become even more powerful if you give it that fruitful ground.
Anybody else want to ask a quick question? I will say that in one case, I was in front of a few people at a workshop asking about how to make things place-based, and one person did mention audio, and that's something that I'd never really considered before, but it can be pretty easy to put into a planetarium program. with
Yeah.
the landscape. And
I mean, my planetarium doesn't have a specific audio speakers in there. I just had the boombox you put in there, and either wire it directly into the system, or if you're operating it, I think that one is wired in because I made sure that the video had audio and it just plays back. And that might mean when I was saying I was recreating the walk into the site, you walk in and I just recorded my steps, and it's quite interesting because water is one key aspect. I mean. This site, as a brief background, is a square embankment set in there, and one of the interpretations is it's to herd cattle or something in there. If you visit the site, you can see nobody in their clear mind would keep cattle in a wet area that is embanked through ditches. So you're getting your cattle to stand in a bog permanently. That's not a good idea for your cattle. And you can even see that when you're walking there. And that's the thing, because you walk there, you hear the normal grass. Then you go, there's a surrounding fence, so you go over a wooden sty, so you can hear the treading over the sty as you go up, and then you go down. Then you enter the site. It becomes different. The rustling grass goes to dry, crunching reeds, as the reeds from the wetland that have dried are there as you're moving into the center. And if you're in the utter center, you can now start hearing the squelching of the now wetter ground as it gives way. All of that supports that kind of you being present in the site, in addition to bird sounds, skylarks at daytime, switching over crows, to just the distant neighing of horses in a wild stampede going past you to have that evening experience. Yes, definitely. One thing that I'm so tempted to do, maybe one of the next times, is add smells. That's something that can also be nicely done. So if you can just gather strange looks, you can get just in the autumn period of time, sort of milky grass and old leaves, pack it into your Tupperware, seal it nicely, and take it into your observatory, and then just at the right moment in time, open it up and see if that works. It's something that I was loving and keen on experimenting with that in the next few sessions.
okay, just at the risk of going just a few more minutes, Dario, I think you have some experience working with 3D in a planetarium. Is that correct?
Yes, actually 3D models, I'm just starting to dive into that world. I already have some 3D models of monuments in Portugal, which I know
Yeah,
Dan knows.
yeah.
Nice to see you again, by the way.
Yeah. Long time, I know.
I have I've been working more with the fisheye images, um, and doing simulations with the alignments in monuments, just like this one.
Hmm.
Actually, my planetarium will be featured in a documentary about the Dolmen da Orca, which is
Hmm.
the largest monument of this kind in my area, where I get to explain all the alignments and to show them as if we were inside the monument. Um, but with 3D models, I'm just starting in.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing with the dolmen as well. When if you got them as a 3D environment, you can actually visualize that kind of visibility window. So to give people the background, these dolmen are essentially, at best, you could describe that as like a graze with a passage. So if you're in the center, you're completely enclosed and looking out of a narrow passage that's very well framed, and these passages frame certain sections on the horizon. So having a 3D model gives you that option not only
Yeah.
to just plonk somebody suddenly in that area, but slowly move them in there to have that experience. But I think the key thing is if you plonk people into a site, the essentially recreating the 2D panorama. At that point, you're moving away from one of the key understandings that precision is really not necessarily something that's intended. You're looking at these windows as wide areas, and if you're in these 3D models, you can actually now start moving left, right, which is what you would do if you're there. Because are you in the middle? Are you to the left? Are you to the right? And at that point, you can see which framing is actually meant. And um, that's what these 3D models really allow. From my point of view, we used that when we looked at these Arbor Low and Jib Hill as these two associated sites that have possibly an avenue Not directly connecting them. It's not an A to B straight line. They sort of start at one and go behind the other one and wind around. Never understood why. It doesn't follow a ridge or anything like that. That's why we did that 3D visualization, to be able to do that, walking around, get view sheds, which parts can we see, at which point do we see that one, and then start to explore. Bearing in mind, this is from my experiential work, the starting point. That's how you would start to identify, oh, this might be an interesting one. Let's go back there, really, to the site and see what can be seen. But again, always with the caveat that, like with your work, you'll have to make sure to throw that back 4,000 years into the past to actually see what's going on, because at that point, interpreting that becomes an interesting, where right to the point, like in your case, Dario, when you're talking about visibilities or stellar alignments with stars and the heliacal rising and things like that, where dating becomes important. You have to put in the times in there as well, which is really, really fascinating. To put it into context with, for example, let's say the southwest of the US as well, understanding aspects like the sun dagger or certain kivas and their shadow plays that are included in there as well. It's really, really important to have a sort of a good 3D model and then explore the shadow casting happening in there as well. All of that, though, as I always said, is just a starting point to then revisit the sites and explore that in more depth. So you can see again how there's this interconnectedness between site and non-site. You play with the virtual site that's informed through the site to then go to the site that's informed through the non-site, and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, which is methodologically really interesting, exploring that connection, how we do that as researchers and how we do that when we're communicating with Planetarium, the experiences at site, because we're essentially trying to convey a real site in a site that's absolutely not real.
Yeah.
Great. So I think that's probably a good time to wrap it up and thank Dan again. I think we had about 2 hours of his time today.
Oh, God,
So
yes.
thank you very much. I
Thanks
noticed
a lot.